Your Excellency and our VP, who's here, as co-directors, I'd like to greet you. But also I'd like to greet the members who are here from the Academy, students community, Your Excellencies, and the partner organization who are here with us. And I can see here I've got my fellow member who have walked this journey, actually members, not just one member, in Kings, working with ALC as practitioners. But also I'd like to recognize former Minister and former Governor, Honorable Kayode. To all of you, because you are important, so that if I don't remember your various positions that you hold, you mustn't say, I've not greeted you because you are not important. You all are. Distinguished guests and friends, we gather in London at a moment that feels like global peace is an extraterrestrial phenomenon. A moment where the tectonic plates of global geopolitics are shifting beneath our feet. Today, as we look out at a fractured world, we must ask ourselves, who will restore diplomacy and respect for sovereignty as instruments to overcome differences, tools to forge global partnership, and a medium to build a better world, where children and citizens live free of war and fears? Allow me to express my sincere gratitude to planners and organizers of the African Week for the kind invitation and warm welcome. It is my utmost pleasure and honor to come and share my perspectives on how best the resourcing of the African Agency should be negotiated, more so in a world that seems to be reversing the gains of peace, shared prosperity, and equality. I intend to speak not merely about African development or investment, but about the agency and how it should be negotiated differently in our fractured global system. African agency means the power of African states, institutions, communities, and citizens to define their own priorities, shape their own policies and values, and control their own resources. It is not charity. It is not dependency. It is not externally scripted development. However, it is sovereignty in action led by Africans. It is important to note that while Africa's development trajectory has been heavily influenced by external prescriptions from the structural adjustment programs of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank in the 1980s and 90s, to contemporary aid conditionalities tied to design, governance, reforms, procurement rules, and fiscal frameworks. While these multilateral institutions have somewhat evolved, the power asymmetry remains embedded in financing structures, subsequently shaping local policies and priorities, often not aligned with the will and the needs of our citizens. Africa has been able to invoke internal capacity despite these challenges, despite these prescriptions. Africa has been able to craft what they want. Examples are many, but I'll just mention a few. The new Partnership for Africa's Development, which actually was set in early in the 90s when the Organization of African Unity transformed itself to the African Union. Africa Agenda 2063, the Africa Peer Review Mechanism, the African Democracy Charter, and the African Continental Free Trade Area are just but a few. But I want to take us back a little bit, because I think when we talk about Africa's agency, it's not only what has happened in the recent history, but there are many experiences of how this agency has evolved over many years and how it has been resourced by Africans themselves. Many a times people will speak about the formation of the African Organization of Unity in 1963, but I always ask, why do we forget 1962 on the formation of PAWO? the Pan-African Women's Organization, formed by market women, formed by women who were from rural areas as smallholder farmers with nothing. But they were able to mobilize around the continent with their own resources and formed a continental organization which has lived to this day. The Organization of African Unity, yes, formed in 1963, itself was the mobilization of many African states who found it necessary to ensure that through solidarity, they are able to advance Africa's liberation in each and every country. Again, these were resources from Africa resourcing its agency. Many would recall student movements, not just the Fees Must Fall, or maybe the Arab Spring, but other students' initiatives across our continent where students were trying to redefine how they need to be part not only of the transformation of the education system, but also of their own social conditions and their citizens. Again, it was resourced internally. And I'm reminding ourselves about these realities because at times like this, we need to look back and say, if we're able to do that then, what can we not do today, having evolved, having the intellectual capacity that is here and even outside here, having people who have been able to form organizations that are resilient to be able to stand on their own. So these instruments, in my view, have not been merely crafted, but if they can be fully implemented and properly resourced, a new trajectory for Africa can emerge. So the question before us is not whether Africa needs resources, it is how the negotiation of those resources can be reinforced rather than undermined. It is also about how can these resources in their negotiation be utilized for strengthening Africa's agency. To unpack this conundrum, I've structured my address to cover these three areas. First, I will share perspective on the meaning of African agency. Second, to provide a diagnostic picture of the structural constraints on the agency. Thereafter, I shall outline some critical insights on the negotiating framework for the resources needed to sustain Africa's agency. Our understanding of Africa's agency needs to evolve from symbolic to structural changes underpinned by meaningful institutional reforms. African agency is not rhetorically sovereignty. It is a combination of material capability, epistemic authority, and policy coordination. When we say African agency must move from symbolic sovereignty to structural influence, we imply having independence of judicial sovereignty and policy autonomy. Policy reforms for Africans by Africans is important. While aligning with global partners is essential, the African agency demands that states must have the autonomy to formulate their own policies that reflect the will of their citizens. Most African states attained independence, but the power to define their own development pathways has been largely influenced by conditionalities set outside Africa, which has tended to disrupt the agenda that Africa wants. Structural power in global finance and trade has remained uneven, relegating Africa to be an extraction site for minerals and raw agricultural products for the world. Epistemic agency is essential to formulate a developmental model informed by local knowledge, research, and resources. Honored Excellencies and colleagues, owing to time limitations, I would like to touch on just 4 binding constraints which I think are necessary for us to reflect on that impede African agency. The first binding constraint is the high dependence of African states to global financial architecture that was designed without their participation. Consequently, the interest and sovereignty of Africa are often compromised by lending conditions that narrow the domestic policy space negotiating the agency will therefore require redefining partnerships so that African governments co-design financing frameworks. And I'm sure all of us would recall just 1 or 2 years ago, maybe 3, when we had the disruption as a result of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, how that disturbed the agricultural trade, and particularly the movement of goods. We also can go back during the COVID period, how that disruption had to force Africa to rethink how it supports itself when actually the preventative, mechanisms as well as vaccines, again, showed the unevenness in our world. But Africa didn't die. Africa reflected on what they can do on their own, and they started to mobilize the resources, but also start to argue within the World Trade Organization on how we need, as countries globally, to also start to look at how we bring issues of equity on vaccine, not just distribution, but also development. And again, it is important to reflect on how institutions such as the African Union must be positioned not as implementers of externally funded agendas, but as agenda setters in global forums. Moreover, in recent times, the availability of developmental aid has become more volatile with the changing geopolitics. We're witnessing an era where the provision of aid is closely tied to whether a country aligns with the powerful global players' ideas of development. South Africa, for its part, has long held a non-alignment upholding human rights, peace, and equality, but we also know what the cost for that has been in recent times. There's an urgent need for the global financing architecture to shift away from conditionality to partnerships. Second is the fragmented negotiating power. The continent is endowed with 54 states and multiple regional economic blocs. Often when these countries negotiate for trade deals or economic partnerships, they do so on an individual basis, lacking the capacity and knowledge possessed by their global partners. When African states act collectively, their bargaining power increases significantly. We have experience in Southern African Customs Union, which applies a common tariff regime and negotiates trade deals as a single bloc. We've also seen some of our states in the Southern African community, particularly Zimbabwe, Angola, and Zambia, when they agree together to work on a joint program and what that has resulted to. I could say the same in West Africa and in East Africa. These are just but some examples that indicate that if we work together in partnership, we can actually ensure that we strengthen the resourcing of Africa's agency. The third binding constraint is the challenge of extractive global value chains that perpetuates underdevelopment in African countries. Looking at the Africa's export basket, it is characterized by raw materials while importing finished goods. The consequence of this is the exploitation of better job opportunities while importing inflation that manifests through the high cost of living, increasing poverty and food insecurity in this continent. Continental frameworks like the Africa Continental Free Trade Area are critical interventions to mitigate the effects of extractive global value chains. They promote localization and intra-African trade, which stimulates industrialization. Through the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, African countries can demonstrate how collective action can reshape economic destiny and reduce Africa's dependency on volatile external markets and supplies. In this sense, negotiating Africa's agency is therefore not a confrontation, it is a recalibration of value chains. Another binding constraint I would like to discuss is the knowledge hierarchies. Africa's agency is not only financial, it is intellectual diversity. African universities, think tanks, and research institutes must be resourced to regenerate homegrown policy solutions and implementation approaches. When research agendas are externally funded and framed, priorities can subtly shift from domestic needs to serve outside interests. Negotiating funding arrangements that allow Africa's institutions to set research priorities is critical to long-term sovereignty. The moment is now for Africa to be positioned not as a passive consumer of global epistemology. It is a moment to negotiate its place as a strategic actor and a generator of knowledge and solutions. My co-chairpersons, before I can outline the negotiating frameworks, let me comment on what resourcing means for this agency. Resourcing the African agency means moving beyond developmental aid to domestic resources mobilization and efficient execution of policies that are coordinated and domesticated to respond to the needs of citizens. Resourcing implies building institutions to advance industrialization and technological upgrading. It talks to developing oriented financial reforms. Resourcing Africa's agency should be about structural enablement, not charity expectations. African agency is strongest when it is internally financed, meaning we must strengthen tax systems, cap illicit financial flows, and renegotiate unfair extractive contracts. Listening to a number of debates these days, there's whole excitement about critical minerals. But where are they found? Most of them are found in this continent. And the truth is, we have the capability, we have the knowledge, we have what it takes to make it work for us. But it requires strategic and tactical moves by our governments, but also by our citizens, to see this as the resource that can be used for Africa's development. It also requires leadership at different levels. It also requires sensitivity and appreciation that it may take just a little longer, not quick fixes. But in terms of leadership, it also means leadership is required at different levels, not only in the state, not only in the legislative frameworks or legislatures, but also among citizens, amongst the academy. How do we ensure that our research capability responds to the challenges of our communities? This, therefore, will demand that we engage not just in technical and administrative reforms, but in political negotiations and new developmental pathways. Honored Excellencies and colleagues, first and foremost, we must negotiate as a collective, because individually we are isolated. However, our collective voices must be multi-layered. This means that the African Union-led common positions in trade, climate change, peace and economic reforms must be supported not only at a continental level, but also at national level and within our regional blocs. We must recognize that Africa's bargaining power needs to increase through scale. We also need to look at how we can strengthen bilateral negotiations where necessary. Africa, as we know, is home to 1.4 billion people, implying that any global financial and/or economic system that continues to marginalize this continent cannot be stable in the long term. The time is ripe to reform global financial governance, focusing on fairer debt restructuring mechanisms. There is merit in reconsidering risks and credit rating methodologies to promote equality and a fairer world. The agency cannot rely solely on external negotiations. We must balance external and internal resourcing, signaling the importance of building internal resource mobilization and strengthening domestic institutional systems that work for us. Negotiating frameworks must leverage strategic platforms to gain scale and access to expand opportunities. Strategic platforms such as the G20, where the African Union is now a member and other member states, needs to be one of those instruments where we can leverage our size and be able to negotiate, working together with other Global South countries that are a member of the G20. The Global South and BRICS are other essential platforms for negotiating Africa's agency. These strategic platforms will ensure Africa is not a site of extraction, but a core author of global transformation. Actually, if we have to rethink, how many Africans are found in these structures? You talk the United Nations, you talk about substructures of the UN such as UNESCO, WHO, and others. There are many African intellectuals who are part of those communities. But how do we work together with them to ensure that we leverage and strengthen Africa's agency? I think this is a challenge for us, honorable members and friends. It is also important to how we look at lawmaking, at oversight, and also holding our governments accountable. Parliamentarians must oversee that debt restructuring and reductions are accelerated, and they must scrutinize international financial and trade agreements to ensure countries are not marginalized. Parliamentarians, as lawmakers and public representatives, can assist not only in negotiating the resourcing of the agency, but also in protecting intergenerational equity. In conclusion, I would like to posit that Africa's agency is not just about economics, but a nucleus of African dignity. Resourcing African agency means ensuring that finance flows strengthen sovereignty, that partnership respect autonomy, and that development is defined by those who live it. The negotiation is not simply about money. It is about power. It is about voice. And it is about the future of the continent whose demographics, dynamism, natural resources, and entrepreneurial energy will shape the 21st century. Let us move from asking how Africa can be supported to asking how global systems must adapt to support Africa's self-determination. I thank you.